Welcome to those of you who are here in the room, and welcome to the participants who are joining us via Zoom. It's really a pleasure for me to kick off our internal speakers series of the Center for Latin American Latinx Studies with a talk by one of our new postdoctoral fellows, one of our 3 new postdoctoral fellows, Maria Laura Pensa. Before I go on to introducing her, let me say that you're welcome to grab lunch and have lunch while the talk is going on. I hope Maria Laura won't mind. Okay, and now without further ado, let me say that Laura will be presenting work that has been partially published or based on work that has been published and has been circulated to some of you may have read her article, but also this is work that is ongoing as she's working as a collaborator in a larger project about maps. So we are really looking forward to your comments and suggestions after her presentation. So the title from today's presentation is From Tierra de Indios, and I guess I should be here so people, From Tierra de Indios Enemigos to Dóciles y Fértiles Países, an exploration of the Insurgent Chaco through its cartography. Laura holds a degree in anthropology from the University of Buenos Aires and a PhD in Romance languages from the University of Michigan. This year, as I mentioned before, she has joined us here at Penn as a Mellon Chas Futures Dispossessions in the Americas postdoctoral fellow. Her work looks into different narratives of the Great Chaco region, which is a lowland region of the Amazonia. You can think of it also as in the tri-border between Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia, the area that irradiates from there, and its indigenous inhabitants. She's interested in the connections between the colonial period and the current state of indigenous imaginaries, land rights, and their conflicts in Argentina. Her research focuses on insurgency, following the trajectories of native groups and spaces that were not subject to colonial and national control until very late in history, or in the history of our countries, which is about late 19th century. So please join me in welcoming Maria Laura to CLALCIS and to Penn.
Thank you, Tulia. Hi, everyone. Is my voice okay? Okay, you let me know. So I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for being here today, also on Zoom. I feel very honored to be opening this year's series of conversations and sharing some of my work with you guys. Particularly, I would like to thank Professor Tulia Faletti, Vivian Rodriguez Rocha, Catherine Bart, and Amanda Bessel for organizing this and for being so welcoming, really, for everyone. To bring you closer to my research, I will start by saying that I'm an anthropologist, and what's more, I started as a very classic field ethnographer, working with indigenous communities in the northeast of Argentina for the most part of my undergrad years, in a region called the Great Chaco. Fast forward 10 years, and I've recently completed a PhD specializing in colonial studies, and what I like to think of a two-way movement from the territory to the archives. Now I'm going to start showing you some maps. Oh yeah, you can do that. Is that better? Sorry, I'm short and I don't wear heels. The Great Chaco region, as you can see in the maps here, although we will see that maps can and do lie, so beware, is a geopolitical space that in this day works as a national frontier between Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Paraguay. But in colonial times, one can say that it was much more than just a frontier. It was one of the largest lowland regions where nomadic and semi-nomadic indigenous occupation and resistance was successful until at least the 19th century. In this area, many different groups were encroached by agents of colonial rule, military, religious, administrators, and others. And yet, a great deal of them maintained relative autonomy for centuries. When I say insurgent indigenous groups or peoples, I mean groups that resisted almost every attempt of colonial dominance over them, being that the emplacement of cities in their territories, religious missions, conversion to Catholicism, exploration of their lands, and personal reduction in systems of work, among others. However, not all these groups were insurgent. Others collaborated in different ways with the colonial project, mediating degrees of coercion, and this is not to say that one set of strategies was better than the other in the long run, whatever the long run means. My interest, however, lays in those groups that simply will not have it, and because of that, narratives that circulated about them are significantly different to others. These are the public enemies of the colony and will later become the public enemies of the nation. This research comes from my dissertation, as Julia said, but it's ongoing, where I explore the creation and dissemination of discourses about insurgent indigenous peoples and lands of the Great Chaco region, from the early colony to the incorporation in national history at the beginning of the 20th century. Mine was a broad research question. In what ways have the indigenous peoples of the lowland shaped colonial national pasts, heritage, and memories? How were their territories defined, inhabited, narrated, contested, and appropriated by colonial national regimes? What are the ties that bind our present to the colonial trajectories that precede and inform the national states? Each of the chapters dealt with a different temporality and type of archival source to answer some of these questions. Today, I will share with you the starting point, an exploration of the Chaco through its cartography. In the next half hour or so, I'll try to show you some of the ways in which colonial agents narrated indigenous lands and peoples of the lowlands, and how these discourses were conveyed in cartographic documents. I will also tell you how naming acts, far from being innocent, enabled very concrete military advances over the people and land, which perpetuated acts of ongoing dispossession, taming an insurgent space into a docile one. You will hear me speak of early 16th to mid 18th century documents, one of the earliest group of sources that we can possibly access to from our present. This is not, however, a talk merely about the past. My interest in these topics is entirely political, and it was born and raised alongside the development of territorial conflicts that are present today in Argentina. From our extractive present, I pull a thread to the history of extraction and stealing of indigenous land. We still need to clarify and connect those events with present-day forms of dispossession that result in what we witness today in Argentina and so many other countries of Latin America. That is, a state of profound and most violent separation between indigenous people and the lands they traditionally inhabit, a culture closer to the understanding of their unique worldviews, a lack of trust in the intelligence of their practices for the preservation and betterment of an environment in crisis. And in a more symbolic note, a permanent, renovated, and illusionary exclusion from the historical imagination, as well as the imagination of a possible future together. As I said before, the type of interethnic relations that some indigenous groups established with colonial agents granted them a most negative written account, and in some cases, the total erasure from official documents. On top of the many caveats and cautions one should have when reading sources for the making of anthrohistory and ethnohistory, if one is interested in the existence and resistance of groups that weren't so friendly to those who oversaw writing practices, then the sources become even more fragmented, scattered, and biased. Cartography stood out to me since it is to this day an important tool that indigenous people employ to visualize their demands to the state. I carried that with me to the archives and found that cartographic documents have always been a privileged way to assert dominion over a piece of land, or at least to claim it. I know some people here might be very aware of the critical cartography framework and the advances they made towards a complex comprehension of cartographic discourse. Still, I'd like to say that the issue with cartography as a form of discourse and its employment in the humanities has never been all too easy, and some of it is still unresolved. Starting in the 1970s, J.B. Harley began to develop a history of cartography that uncovered the constant political decisions involving the making of a map, the ideological postulates that underpin its production and distribution, and the silences that inhabit these documents. Until then, maps were used either as decorative instruments embellishing a historical narrative or as evidence of the precise geographic location of places and people, giving them a value of scientific truth that resisted all criticism. The very fruitful idea of the map as a fiction reveals not only its discursive side, but also its essential paradox. That is, to the extent that cartography became more objective due to the techniques and technologies made possible by the financing of modern states, it also became the instrument for the deployment and reproduction of dominant ideology. As Dennis Wood would have it, this is what maps do, they work, by which he meant work in at least two ways. For one thing, maps operate effectively, they don't miss. But on the other hand, they also sweat, they toll. They apply themselves to an end that is no other but to keep the incessant reproduction of the culture that originated them. From a colonial studies perspective, there are historical reasons that give these documents a specific place within the narrative of dispossession, conquest, and colonization, and even in the formation of national states. I mean that it is possible to set foot in the territory only because it is possible to put a finger on the map. Or, in the words of Barbara Mundi, it is necessary to imagine a region and map it, and vice versa. With a focus on the cartographic image as an arena where different worldviews meet, fight, and usually one of them overpowers the other, scholars like Walter Mignolo and others have made very clear that these representations are fundamental to our understanding of indigenous interethnic relations, as well as their conceptions of space, place, and dwelling. In a well-known passage, Mignolo suggests that maps are to native territoriality what grammaticas and dictionaries are to native languages. My own take, informed by these and other authors, is that there is something quite unique about cartography that we must continue to tap on to unravel. However valuable the tenets of critical cartography are, the type of reading focused on textuality leads to the underestimation of the visual character of the maps. When the map becomes a text or a controlled fiction, it is often overseen that, in addition to being guided by a certain dominant ideology that produces and needs them, in addition to serving specific interests, in addition to being biased by the values of their authors, that is, in addition to sharing a number of characteristics with any other written document, first, a map is an image. No longer decorative image that silently illustrate historic manuals, but complex cultural objects that are part of and are likely to be understood from visual culture. To make maps speak, I believe, we must comprehend their hybrid nature and reconnect the map with other cultural objects. That is, learn how to look at images to obtain historical or ethnographic information. Along these lines, Matthew Edney suggests that the idea of mapping or what a map is, it's not a quality defined by who produces the image, but by the use that a reader gives it and the context in which it intervenes. This idea dialogues with classic colonial studies who shift the attention from the cartographic image on a flat surface to the indigenous subject who looks at it, produces it, interprets it, and even to the subject who does not need it and has other forms of visual or territorial representation. We might take this as a departing point for both visual and colonial studies. A large part of the responsibility for giving meaning to a map is on the viewer and not on the image itself. Revisiting cartographic documents from an interdisciplinary perspective allows us to abandon highly restricted definition of map, a portion of terrain represented on a plane, to instead think about transversal problems, such as the logic of representation between the image and the referent it evokes. It is no longer a matter of saying whether the map is technical, political, neutral, or an ideological image. It is about understanding what it allows us to see and how it does it, how we can act through what we see on maps. The cultural functioning of the map is what needs to be unpacked. Maps are part of devices that alter the forms of the world in which we live in and are put into practice for useful purposes. There are many examples of this in our everyday life, starting with the mini GPS devices that we carry around everywhere and fear being without. Not too differently, during colonial times, visual operations were key to the making of discourses about self, otherness, and the possibilities of conquest and colonization. Visual culture theorist Nicolas Mircea who has a very important book on visuality departing from the slave plantation complex, highlights the complexity of images to the point of proposing that they constitute an archive through which we can access subordinate stories that are silenced in written documents. The author calls visuality to the visualization of historical processes from the point of view of authority, that is, the ways in which authority creates its internal others and subordinates, both discursively and visually. A key aspect is that once that the separation between authority and subordinates is established, this relation is rendered natural or evident. Visual complexes are historically, locally, and socially determined, but in all cases, they function from three main processes. First, they classify a group of people through acts of naming. Then they separate this group with the intention of segregating the subjects. And finally, they make this classification and separation be taken as the natural order of things, an aestheticization of the status quo. Attention to images as gears of a device that puts them into operation in the company of other objects is one of the fundamental contributions of this renewed critical view from visual studies. We will now look at some parts of the visual complex of the Chaco. It is important to say that these are merely two images, but as every other piece of archival information, the reading or the seeing that I make of them is informed by dense knowledge of the subject, other archival sources, scholarly work, and critical theory. This beautiful map is a rare find, an early cartography for the area next to the city of Asunción, founded in 1537, the biggest and most important port on that side of the Atlantic until Buenos Aires took off a century later. A cartography is different from a cartography insofar as it doesn't guide spatial relations, since it doesn't include any form of route or itinerary to access the spaces, nor it gives information about distance, relevance, relative sizes, etc. The city of Asunción was also the link between the Andean system and the Atlantic, relatively close to the city of Tucumán, as you can see on the screen. Separated by a region known by many names, here it's called the land of enemy Indians, or Tierra de Indios Enemigos. The interethnic context that one must understand to see this image is that the city of Asunción was largely built on the somehow forceful cooperation of hundreds of Guarani families. There's a sort of legend stating that Guaranis and Spaniards related as relatives, and because of that, the foundation of what today is Paraguay would have been more harmonious than other regions of the empire. In the last decades, several scholars have demystified this story and proved that while the Spaniards took the rights of relatives by taking indigenous women as their partners, they did not fulfill the obligations that the Guarani system of reciprocity demanded, giving rise to abuses of all kinds against Guarani men and women. In this first moment, however, the categories of friendly Indians and enemy Indians began to appear in the documentary record to distinguish between Guaranis and others, those who were not considered subject to colonial rule. At the same time, Asunción became a colonial enclave that needed to be defended from enemy Indians, those who had been enemies of the Guarani in the past and were now enemies of the city. Around 1670, there was a relocation of Indian towns due to the attacks from nomadic groups, and 12 presidios were founded to keep these groups contained. This is the context in which this image functions. The authors are unknown, but in an exercise of historical imagination, we could suppose and extend that assumption to most of colonial cartography, that just as the natives had participation, forced or not, in the construction of cities and roads and forts, they might have participation in the preparation of these images. This authorship, as Mignolo stated for the case of New Spain, is evidence in the conception of space represented from the diversity of scales and proportions, in the increased size in some of the elements of the landscape, and in the two-dimensionality that we can see in this image. The image is divided into halves, the castle in the lower half, the river in the upper half. The way in which this division is made on the one hand is the exclusive use of straight lines in the lower plane and curves in the upper plane, a subtle technique that nevertheless determines the way in which our gaze travels through the plane and divides it. And on the other hand, the use of colors with which a surface, very specific, of the land is painted. The castle is located almost entirely on a white space, and the use of white space or blank space has a long history in cartography. Hey? Yeah, I can do that. Oh, you can see the castle. Let me see if I can do that.
I think it's pretty
I think you can hide it. Can I? Oh. Where did I do that? Hide video panel? Yes. You sure? No, that wasn't it. High names of annotators? No. High floated meeting controls? Yes. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So as I was saying, the use of blank space or white space has a very long history in cartography, and it's mostly associated with spaces open for exploration, for grab, for conquest. It functions similarly to the category of desert, which is a common one. Okay, now I can. What the image allows us to see is the wheel of a defense. The perspective assumed over time will be widely associated with military cartography, and it's called the bird's eye view. This perspective, which applies only to the castle, aims to highlight the solidity of the site to account for the space occupied by the only straight lines in the plane. This view exaggerates the dimensions of the castle, which appear larger than the entire river. Everything in this section of the image collaborates with a defensive attitude, from the precision in the outline of each of the blocks and the tiles to the detail of the lookout post and the clarification, for example, of the existence of a weapons warehouse, knowing that at the time in Paraguay, weapons were really scarce, so that was probably empty. In each of the towers, we're allowed to see numerous uniformed individuals firing in all directions, each group under the name of a Christian saint. The soldiers are active, they're vigilant, although the bullets do not direct to any specific object, animal, or person. So what do we see? The interior of the castle, the courtyard, and when we only see because the perspective allows us to, what the image wants us to see, what remains within the minimum space protected by the bullets, perhaps what the bullets protect. The coat of arms of Castilla y León, rising over the main door. Flag of the empire is where our gaze stops when we see the castle. It is the center or the punctum, the detail that attracts me and at the same time pulls us away. Topographic references on this map are scarce, and once again, the challenge is to try to elucidate what the record allows us to see, not only what is hiding or missing. By this time, the land of enemy Indians was named in several administrative and religious records as Chaco or Chacohualamba. The name is supposed to come from an indigenous hunting technique, that which corners the prey before killing it. Couldn't be more right to express the processes of conquest and colonization, and yet in this map there is no name for the region, probably because of its choreographic nature. However, the cultural functioning of the image contributes to the imagination of a space and influences decision over lands and people. The map textually tells us that the Indians who live on the other side of Paraguay River are enemies, but the meaning of the word is not transparent. They are enemies of the Hispanic Creoles, who position themselves in a defensive attitude, but they're also enemies among themselves, a quality of hunter-gatherer groups of the lowlands that generated a high level of anxiety in the conquerors. While the image informs us of a defense attitude of the Hispano Creoles, the indigenous activity is far from being passive. Unlike the soldiers who shoot in all directions, the arrows come out of the land of enemy Indians but do not enter it, nor are they directed at the castle. The Indians on the ground shoot at those less distinguishable who canoe down the river. The image allows us to see the existence of enemies and how those enemies behave to one another. Lastly, let us look at the enemy Indians, of which the image shows us a very particular selection. The people are in a row looking toward the river to the canoes, all male figures or with little sexual differentiation. We do not see families, women, children, domestic, foster, animals, anything. Nor does it show us homes or possessions, in accordance to an imaginary about the hunter-gatherer groups that did not have a fixed address and were scattered on the land. However, the detail of some of the figures shows close contact that allows us to distinguish accessories, documents, and weapons such as bows, arrows, and spears. Some figures have more ornament than others, colored headdresses, and distinctive forms of clothing that tells us about different roles and functions between the group. One could assume that there is a close knowledge of these people, but that knowledge, those interethnic relationships, are overridden in the definition of enemies. The itinerary of the map is erased, leaving only the situation that is functional to the emplacement of a prison. The final product is a road of individuals who, called enemies, seem to be in the middle of nowhere with the sole objective of starting a war. In this map, as in the literature of the time, the Chaco is not a space of easy access, rather the contrary. Many accounts speak of how rough and mischievous the terrain and the people were. Land and people usually come together in descriptions, transferring characteristics from one to the other. This is a common colonial operation, one that separates the West from the rest. As in the image, the sphere of nature, the upper part, is separated from the sphere of culture, the lower part. The map works in the context of early contacts and offensive strategies, but at the same time, it validates these strategies. For many decades, nothing seemed to last. Agreements, missions, entire cities were destroyed, not only by the indigenous groups, but also by the nature of the Chaco terrain. The city of Guadalcazar, for example, was founded several times as one of the earliest centers for indigenous labor and commerce, and it was destroyed by indigenous raids and natural disasters several times. This might sound scattered to us, but the anti-state indigenous resistance that profited from the intimate knowledge of such difficult terrain granted the land and their inhabitants a halo of mystery, enchantment, and curse. In 1708, a Tucuman governor declares the war on the Chaco and its natives, proposes a plan of extermination, and claims that the only way to open the route, the commercial route, is to either kill or displace every single hunter-gatherer. The plan doesn't entirely work, although violent military campaigns start to enter the region every so often with dismal results, but the same conditions. The point is that in the land of enemy Indians, violence is permitted and fair. Let it be clear that the Chaco is still indigenous land. It's not yet land of the empire. Now, let's fast forward a century. Buenos Aires became an important center of commerce. Asunción is eager to regain some relevance on that commercial landscape, and yet, after a full century of intense exploration, attempts of conversion, military campaigns, and city founding, the longed-for route that unites Asunción and Tucumán has not yet been established. The city of Tucumán is thriving and proliferates with satellite cities. The haciendas are productive, and the whole of colonial peace is still heavily threatened by the enemy Indians. Many of the Guaycurú families were settled in Jesuit reductions, although the success of this enterprise in the Chaco is nowhere to be compared with the Guarani missions of Asunción, known as the miracle of God on earth. Missions were few. They were often used by nomads as new stops in their traditional routes, that is, where they didn't take them straightforward like markets, from where to extract cattle, horses, and other goods. To make a long story short, one could say that the alternation of offensive and defensive strategies implemented by colonial agents is evident of just how hard it was to control both the Chaco region and their inhabitants. After 1770, with the Bourbon reforms, colonial agents deployed effective actions to impose its presence and control. Jerónimo de Matorras, that guy, the governor of Tucumán, insisted with the purpose of pacifying the region and attracting the numerous indigenous groups that had abandoned reductions for what was still considered the hinterlands. This map is a record that arises from Matorras' expeditions. In addition to guiding relations in space, the elements that make this image propose a narrative to convert a border space into a territory incorporated to the imperial project, in the same way that its natives were intended to be annexed to the controlled population. In this image, peaceful relations are a historical fiction that works as an omen, but not a realistic representation of reality. The land and the people are presented in a much more amicable way, converted into subjects of empire by means of ceremonies of possession. The first thing that happens with this map is that it doesn't look like a map. The saturation of elements in the composition marks a distance from the conventions of the time, and it is difficult to find the map. We look for that which represents, on a smaller scale, the surface of the earth, and we also look for the signs with which this representation is conventionally conveyed. We fall into the first illusion of mimesis, the belief that the map is a miniature of the world. The elements that are in the margin and the scene represented in the lower part respond to the second function of mimesis, the map as a theater of the world, a representation or staging for an audience. However, far from separating these two parts, the image works in a complementary way. It's not a center surrounded by decorative elements, but a complex composition that combines mapping as a whole. This map is about informing history. It tells a story, however fabricated, of intimate knowledge and final triumphal conquest. For the sake of timekeeping, I will focus on the human scene portrayed at the bottom of the image, but please know that elsewhere I have extended the analysis to this very complex piece of visuality and information that the map offers, and there are many. Some of them are the use of toponyms, the references that are their housing in a civilization scale, and you can barely see that, but it's that, like Mancheria de Infieles, that's just wonderful. The X marking in ruins of Spanish cities destroyed by indigenous groups, the hiding of indigenous knowledge, the ornamentation that conveys elements of authority and static continuity with Europe. I cannot refer to them all, there are many, but in the history of the map and the history that this map tends to establish, they're all important. They all make up for a narrative. I'll read you the legend here at the bottom. It says, the famous Cacique Paikin, chief of the many nations of the great Chaco, presents himself in the center of those fertile and docile countries to Mr. Matorras, governor of the province of Tucumán. From a discursive point of view, it is striking that Paikin presents himself before Matorras, given that the governor had to organize an expedition with almost 400 men to reach La Cangaye. Sources for this agreement relate that the government ordered to engrave the year and name of the peace that was celebrated on a tree. You can see it right there, beneath the cross. In the image, the carved tree and the cross are on the left side where the Spanish soldiers stand. This engraving is a way of printing positivity on a land where 4 colonial cities had already disappeared. That is, they had been destroyed by insurgent natives. Behind the crouching female, we see mountains. Striking as well, if one thinks that the name given to this region was also Plains of the Manso, there are no mountains in the Chaco region. I understand that the mountains refer to Tucumán, where the expedition comes from. That is, they function in the image to account for an itinerary, but they do not clearly represent the land. The scene is also divided into 2 halves, the middle part being more or less the palm tree behind the figures of Paikin and Matorras. On the left side is civilization, cloth, people dressed, tidy, private property at their feet. On the right side, a gargoyle faces the natives on horseback, just a hint of monstrosity, if you will. Natives are mounted on their horses in line with stories that made about them, about the eagerness to steal cattle, their natural talent to ride them, and the danger that equestrian groups meant for colonization. This imagery relates to the idea of raids and the fear of indigenous attacks as well. They're half naked, sometimes they're wearing feather headdresses, and their spears go up in the trees. Now, the fundamental inversion happens up front. Paikin stands on the left, Matorras on the right, each up front of the group of men that the other seems to command, each siding with the other's elements. Phenotypically similar, although their attire differentiates them, the figures are in open positions toward each other, the governor slightly in front of the indigenous leader, both armed with knives and fire guns. They're not enemies, they couldn't be. The idea of symmetry generated by this inversion is complemented by the harmonic lines forming the back on the plane. What the image allows us to see is the idea of equity, a pact between equals or equivalents, almost interchangeable. However, the diplomatic agreements between colonial agents and indigenous groups or leaders were far from being equal for the parties. Aside from the effects of the pen that usually make it seem like Hispano-Creole had the upper hand, because these were their ways of resolving conflicts, the structural conditions of inequality and a very long history of violence between the parties guarantee that these agreements were complicated and more often than not, fragile. The Chaco was nowhere near to be a docile country, but it was indeed fertile in both a literal and economic way, and hence the need to convert it into docile terrain. The Peace of La Cangaye, which is this event, was considered and at the time constituted as historical precisely because it was so hard to establish agreements and military advancements over natives that had different patterns of leadership, warfare, and negotiation. The center of the map and the lower scene are linked, and in that way, an event and a territory are converted into a historical narrative. The 2 functions of the mimesis combine to give the idea of a world in miniature and at the same time, the history of that world. In the future, this event will be used as jurisprudence for future land taking and grabbing by colonial and national agents. In this way, the Peace of La Cangaye is visualized as a founding myth of a space called Gran Chaco. The map not only hides the itinerary, but survives the events that follow its construction. Paikin and Matoraz died the next year after signing this peace, and before that, the groups that Paikin led apparently attacked a religious mission, ignoring a point of the agreement. It is not my intention here to narrate the intricacy of this event, but to understand how it works in the image, and at the same time, how the image works, highlighting the relationship between a fact, an experience among many that was selected, and a space. The link between these two provides the historical character within the foundational narrative of a region that it is now considered docile, not populated by enemies, but by friends, intimately known and easy to access. With these two images, I tried to briefly summarize some of the history of an insurgent piece of land and many insurgent indigenous groups. This is always difficult to convey, but I believe in the ability of cartography to condense and summarize the symbols and meanings scattered through different archival sources. I came to cartography as it was one of the few records that directly addressed the existence and persistence of groups not subject to the colonial domain. They had no other choice, even when purposely hidden, and there are so many examples of this that I didn't show today. The visual complexes produced during colonial times for this region can't do without their presence. The different operations by which they are shown first as enemies and later as friends are not exhausted here, but these are rather the two extremes of a continuum of interethnic, ongoing, and persistent act of dispossession. Finally, one must return to the primary discussion when talking about indigenous dispossession in the lowlands, and that is dispossession of land. I mean those original, cumulative, and renovated acts that to this day separate indigenous groups from the territories that they traditionally inhabit. As I said in the beginning, my motivation to investigate colonial cartography came from fieldwork, more precisely from an instance of participative mapping in the context of territorial demands that an indigenous community was making to the national state. Let me be clear, indigenous communities don't need this research to understand the traditional occupation or the history of their ancestors. They have that knowledge. They don't need me for that. That being said, this research and many others could help as an evidence for the nation state and its agents who still need to be persuaded of the pre-existence of indigenous people to the Argentine nation. I hope it also contributes to the collective imagination of our past as something greater and more diverse than the nation state. Since it is, I think, by broadening the understanding of our past, then a society can begin to expand the conversation in the present and maybe imagine different futures. Thank you.
Laura, for that really thought-provoking, very, very interesting talk. I'll open the floor to questions and comments, suggestions from the audience. And if you don't mind filling in your own questions, that'd be great. If you want me to moderate, then
I can moderate myself. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
I think Anne. Yeah.
There was someone over there.
Oh, I didn't see them. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I wanted to ask about the other kinds of documents that are off stage.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I really appreciate your focus and a multi-layer, several kind of add-ons that other people are not for. So I really appreciate it. It's fascinating. I wanted to ask, though, there's a way in which cartography specifically perhaps erases some other actors, and here I'm thinking about the regular clergy, especially, but about a whole bunch of documents that are documents that come from religious orders. And in some cases, maybe those also contain cartographic materials, but it's possible, or I actually just wanted to ask you to think about whether or not cartography maybe overprivileges for us some of the activities of clergy on the ground, if
Well,
that's possible.
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. Actually, in the case of the Chaco, and I was going to show you 3 maps, so that was just too much. But the second one that I was going to show was made by the company of Jesuits. So Jesuit, basically. So the Chaco region, kind of like every region, has their history with religious actors. And in the case of the Chaco, it was all about the Jesuits, and there were big producers of cartography, like big. Actually, this map, I have a theory, I cannot prove it, but I think that the centerpiece of that map is actually based on a map from Camaño, which is a very well-known Jesuit. So in the case of the Chaco region, I would say that Jesuits actually produced a lot of maps, apart from other documents, and I do work with them. I work with Jesuits' diaries of explorations where they were missioning. I work with their memories when they were expelled. And I work with the letters, las cartas anuas, that they send every single year to Rome and back to report about the missions and sometimes to imagine what they would like that year to have been like. But they were big producers of cartography. And in this region, Camaño, I would say most of the most detailed knowledge of the Chaco comes from his work. And it's funny because then when you see other cartographies like the Lille and like some really great cartographers, they take so much from Jesuits and they never say it. So it's actually, I don't know how it is in like other places, but in the case of the Chaco, one of the principal producers of documents and cartographers are the Jesuits, for sure. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. The Zoomers.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And one particular thing you mentioned that really piqued my interest was the idea that, I don't know how this had not really occurred to me before, but that a map, what it sort of means is not just determined by who makes it, but like just like any other text by the viewer also, right? And you even gestured towards the possibility of Indigenous subjects being the viewer of these maps. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how maybe these examples or others that you analyzed read differently when beheld by an Indigenous subject, or just read differently in general, maybe historical points in time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, I can take this example. That whole thing comes, from the discussion of critical cartography and also from the discussion within colonial studies. And one of the key arguments or like things that we still fight about, it's about authorship, right? So who makes these maps, right? And in a map like the one above, it says Tierra, Indios, Enemigos, we do have some elements to think that there was Indigenous participation, the two-dimensionality, the exaggeration of some of the elements. It's always going to be a guess. And by this, I mean that particularly when folks follow the trajectories and representations of groups that were not the groups that produce documents, insurgent, nomad, semi-nomad groups, we are always going to be kind of guessing. But if you take that same scene and, I used to, when I was thinking about authorship in this map, my first thought was, well, this was clearly made by, I don't know, administrators, right? Hispano Creole people, and look at this exoticized version of Indigenous people. And that was my first read. And then I was like, well, but this is a lot of detail, that man, the tall one with the headdress, he's a Piogonac, right? He's a healing man. Like, wouldn't it be possible that an Indigenous person was making this sort of pintura, right? So that is an open discussion that in most cases, it's not going to have an answer. We're probably never going to know, right? Particularly in the case of maps, and that is one of the super complicated aspects of maps, is that they were taken as images for so long, and in so many archives, they're separated from the original legajos, right? So if you go to Seville, where this map is located, you would see that that is supposed to be related to Charcas 30. And I've been up and down Charcas 30. I've read it back and forwards. The letter, it's not there. So we don't even know if this map was made before the emplacement of the castle, sort of as a projection, or after. And that actually does make for the meaning. So there are many things that we could interpret in one or the other way, and I don't think we're ever going to get some answers. And authorship and different readings, it's probably one of them. I love to think that this map has heavily indigenous participation, because I don't know, there's just something so intimate about it that I think it is, but it could also be read as, you know, just a vision from Hispano Criollas, you know, just waging war. So it's kind of an open interpretation, I think. Tulia, and I don't know your name.
Thank you so much. It has been really so wonderful, you know, lots of thoughts. And I'm going to take two questions, but definitely, you know, look forward to working so close together this year. In the article that is circulated for the talk,
That's about the first map.
you choose to talk about a history of cartographicals,
Yes.
not maps.
Yes.
You know, your talk, you refer to maps.
Mm-hmm.
Have you moved away from the notion that we should stay away from the word of maps, or are you just doing it for our own benefit because, you know, otherwise it would be a mouthful to say the history of cartographicals every time?
Partially.
to a map. So I wonder, you know, have your thought about this evolved since 2020, or do you still think that we should talk about the history of cartography?
I mean, I do think that broadly we should talk about Cartográficos, and I'll tell you why. There are so many other ways to represent, to guide and represent relationships in space. Like, you know, the most common example for this, I'm sure many folks here know it, is the idea of quipus. You know what a quipu is? It's some people here know it. I see Lucia, she's nodding. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I'll explain it simply. It's the idea of an object that it's braided, and within that braiding, there is a telling of a story, right? Very simply put. And in that same telling of a story, there are ways in which people represent their relationships through space that are not on a plane. So there are objects, right? Like quipus. There are other objects for, I don't know, the Amazonian Andean regions that have to do with collecting material like organic remains and putting them together in a way that that object represents an itinerary. That means the place from which you gather all those things, it's kind of a map. It tells a story about spatial relations. So I do think that generally speaking, and there are also, you know, oral memory and storytelling and singing and praying and so many ways in which people represent their knowledge about space that are not on a plane. And this happens particularly with lowland groups of the Chaco. You know, they all use maps to prove and fight for the existence and pre-existence of the state. But when I started working with them, we would go to the places, like the places that they went hunting and they went gathering this stuff and the other, and we would mark them on a GPS, and they would say to me, we don't need maps, we have the maps. So I feel like we always need to like leave that open door for other forms of talking about space and representing space and showing knowledge about space that are not drawings on a plane. That being said, like on a surface, that being said, most of the knowledge that we have comes from maps and planes. And this is the first case is a plane, it's not a map. How is that different? Well, for one thing, we don't know if it was made before or after the castle. So if it's a map, it should be made after. So there's a lot of like technicality with cartographers that I know I don't want to fight with them, but there are so many other ways. You know, if you do a drawing and you're thinking about a space that you will build, is that a map? Is that not a map, right? If you tell a story about a place where you went to, or you tell the story of how to get a certain thing, is that a map, right? So I do think that registros cartográficos in a broad sense could encompass even oral forms of talking about space and remembering. I've been staying very close to maps and planes, but I'm looking forward to expanding that sort of, but I do feel like it's a broader archive.
I have another question, but
Okay.
I'll ask at the end. I asked the question in Spanish. I think I have to.
Sí, puedes hacer lo que quieras en español,
Bueno,
por supuesto.
muchas gracias por la charla. Tenía una curiosidad sobre la función de estos mapas a través del tiempo en el espacio transatlántico,
¿Ok?
en relación con los huecos o vacíos que puede haber en la conquista colonial. Es que cuando estaba escuchándote pensaba, por ejemplo, en las cartas de Cortés, cómo las cartas construyen una ficción sobre cómo se está llevando la conquista. Al principio es un fracaso absoluto y luego tiene que narrar su propio éxito debido a esta distancia que hay entre el espacio metropolitano, ¿no?, y el espacio como que se va de la periferia, que va a ser tomado. Entonces me interesaba saber quién era el público que consumía estos mapas más directamente. ¿Era la corona? ¿Era directamente el rey? Funcionaba como un complemento a los memoriales coloniales, ¿no? Porque las autoridades locales enviaban estos memoriales al rey y en base a eso decidía la administración. Esa es la primera parte. Y lo segundo es que me llama la atención cómo en el primer mapa del 17, ¿no?, del 1600, se ven como estos indígenas combatiendo. Y en el otro mapa, que coincide casi ya con la descomposición total del imperio, ¿no?, se ve una
Están
realidad ordenada.
Sí.
Se ve una realidad como armoniosa, ¿no? Es decir, como si un proceso se hubiera completado mientras se está hablando de la descomposición imperial. Entonces, me llamaba la atención cómo habías visto esta evolución. Esas eran como mis dos.
Bueno, gracias por las dos. Y están como relacionadas la una con la otra. Un poco porque los mapas, en general, al ser una imagen visual, yo digo que hay algo que es realmente especial acerca de los mapas y que pueden decir cualquier cosa, ¿verdad? Y que muchas veces se usan para decir algo que contradice, son como una expresión de deseo. Por ejemplo, en el primer mapa que vemos como los indios enemigos y guerreando entre sí, los dos mapas están en el Archivo General de Indias, en Sevilla. Los dos pasaron en algún momento por la audiencia de Charcas. Entonces, estos dos mapas, pienso yo, en ningún momento fueron producidos para ser consumidos por una audiencia local. Son mapas que forman parte, por ejemplo, en el primer caso, son documentos que fueron de Asunción a Charcas, y en el segundo caso, como son expediciones de Maturrás, fueron de Tucumán a Charcas y de Charcas a Sevilla. Son documentos que justifican, que piden fondos, muchas veces piden fondos. En el primer caso, Paraguay se pasó todos sus 50 años pidiendo fondos, pidiendo armas, pidiendo comida, pidiendo ayuda, básicamente. Sobre todo el tema de las armas, y por eso me interesa tanto que en el mapa esté como representado el almacén de armas, cuando no había una arma en Paraguay, realmente. Y un poco esta representación de los indios creo yo que funciona como una imaginación, primero, para pedir financiamiento para la construcción de presidios, segundo, porque era una amenaza real, es decir, era una amenaza real, eran grupos que atentaban contra el avance colonial todo el tiempo, y tercero, porque, bueno, justifican todo el proyecto, y además esta representación justifica otra serie de cosas que vemos en los archivos, que son las expediciones a tierra de indios, a tierra adentro, el robo de personas y su repartimiento en ciudades como Tucumán, Buenos Aires, Lima, que es algo de lo que no hablé hoy, pero muchas veces los mapas prefiguran o como que preautorizan expediciones punitivas de las cuales se llevan muchísimas personas indígenas y las reparten con la excusa de que son salvajes, enemigos, etcétera, etcétera. En el segundo caso, que como bien decís, es muy loco que en 1770 los jesuitas recién expulsados, el imperio crumbling como totalmente, estemos viendo como esta imagen de ordenamiento. También tiene que ver con los últimos esfuerzos del imperio, digamos, para justificar su acción, ¿no? Como que toda la idea de la civilización a través de la misión religiosa de los jesuitas y tal, tiene que ver con justificar una guerra justa, con crear un propio relato del papel de la colonia, en este caso española, en las Américas, que digo, fue sujeto de muchos debates desde Valladolid en adelante, ¿no? El tratamiento de los indígenas, cuál es el rol de la colonia española, y muchas veces estos documentos justifican al mismo tiempo que como que la idea que está acá validada es que de estos tierras de indios enemigos que no tenían paz y qué sé yo, pasamos a sujetos que salen a buscar la reducción, ¿no? Como que el relato del mapa es ese, estos indígenas de Paiquín salen a pedir el bautismo, hay muchísimos documentos de jesuitas, de administradores, de militares, que hablan sobre la desesperación de los indígenas para salir a pedir reducciones jesuitas, que no, En el Chaco por lo menos no, en otros lugares sí, en el Chaco no.
Y por eso también una contestación de alguna forma la leyenda negra, ¿no? De los españoles como salvajes, porque ahí eran sumamente afrancesados.
Sí.
Parecen franceses, no españoles.
Sí, sí, y este es Matorraz, que es una persona que estaba directamente loca. O sea, es uno de los gobernadores de Tucumán, tienen como una historia bastante trágica. Todos terminan tomados por su fiebre conquistadora, y Matorraz es uno de ellos. Pero Matorraz y Esteban de Urízar y Ares Coapachaga, que es un antecedente de él, estaban realmente ensañados con el Chaco a un nivel enfermizo. O sea, realmente pensaban que la amenaza para toda forma de orden y estabilidad del imperio eran los indígenas del Chaco y que había que matarlos a todos. Entonces esto es como un acto de civilidad que estaba hecho para las cortes españolas, pero en las cartas de Matorraz se ve lo que Matorraz realmente pensaba, que no era hacer pueblos de reducción, era repartirlos a todos para que, con el objetivo de romper toda forma de organización política, ¿verdad? Que los indígenas no estuvieran juntos con otros indígenas. Esa era como la verdadera amenaza. Gracias. Tulia, ¿vos me querías preguntar otra segunda cosa?
Sí, yo tengo una pregunta que en realidad está bien relacionada y tenía que ver con los caballos en esta representación.
Sí.
Me parece que realmente tal vez sea parte de lo que estabas narrando como una representación de lo que quiere ser y no de lo que es. O sea, mi pregunta era si realmente vos crees que los indígenas en la zona del Chaco tenían acceso a tantos caballos.
No sé si a tantos como se muestran acá, pero sí es verdad que, o sea, sí es verdad, bueno, el claim que acabo de hacer, pero sí podemos pensar por todos los registros de reducciones jesuitas y de pueblos de frontera y de Tucumán y Santiago del Estero y el norte de Córdoba y tal, que los grupos indígenas del Chaco, que en el primer mapa vemos, no tienen ganado estable y no andan a caballo, son canoeros, la mayoría, los que andan por los ríos, adoptan muy rápidamente el caballo. De hecho, como hay toda una teoría sobre el complejo ecuestre y qué tanto se introdujo en las Américas, y lo cierto es que los pueblos de tradición nómada, cazadora y recolectora, como por ejemplo los pueblos de la Patagonia, los mapuches, los tehuelches, los ranculches y tal, y los pueblos nómades del Chaco, al parecer adoptaron muy rápidamente la forma de locomoción a partir del caballo, lo cual, claro, para pueblos que eran nómades, digamos, trajo muchos beneficios. Y también, en el caso del Chaco, como todas las ciudades y los emplazamientos coloniales eran tan inestables, había bastante más ganado como cimarrón, porque las ciudades duraban poco. Muchas ciudades en el Chaco duraban poco. Son pocas, como Tucumán, bueno, Tucumán no es del Chaco, pero Asunción, Corrientes y demás, las que tienen haciendas más estables. Entonces había una circulación de ganado cimarrón aparentemente más amplia que en la Pampa y Patagonia. Entonces yo creo que quizás esto es un poco exagerado, porque las bandas de cazadores y recolectores como mucho eran 50 personas, y dudo que 50 personas tengan 25 caballos, pero sí es algo que le trajo mucha ansiedad a los españoles. Toda la cosa del indígena montado a caballo, y tenían representaciones como de centauros, ¿no? Como que los indígenas se hacían unos con el caballo porque lo montaban tan bien y eran tan habilidosos. Y bueno, había un poco ahí como de bronca, que le daba bronca que dicen que le fuera tan bien con los caballos. Que era una manera tan efectiva de, ellos decían, de caer como el rayo sobre las ciudades y retirarse a los interiores. Conociendo la topografía del Chaco, para los españoles era muy difícil andar a caballo en Chaco. Por los ríos, por los cañados, por las bañadas, por las piedras, por el clima, porque en distintas estaciones del año no podían pasar por los mismos lugares. Pero los grupos indígenas, que conocían muy bien su territorio, con el caballo, estaban como querían. Gracias, Tulia.
Puedo decir que en el caso de los mapuches lo mismo. Sabemos que se adoptó muy rápido.
Same.
Y que aprendieron a reproducirlo y a montar.
Y que lo montaban mucho mejor que los españoles. Los españoles les daban mucha bronca eso.
Como parte importante de la cultura.
Total.
Should we go back to the stage, or
Whatever you want.
ask for the rest of the audience? I had a question about war between
Mhm.
Spanish. Throughout this, like the colonial period,
How much was the war, you mean?
how much periods, was it like a constant period of war? Was
Well-
there periods of peace and commerce?
So because of the nature, also because of the nature of the terrain, the Chaco is known as bolson, right? So it's a kind of, different from Patagonia, which is like far stretching to the south. This was not a situation of a line of frontier, right? So there are no lines. There are cities, tiny cities, and sometimes enclaves like fuertes, prisons, things like that. And they are surrounded by guards all the time. And the offensive and defensive strategies never truly stop. Like, I would say that it's, broadly speaking, it's like 30, 40 years of really intense offensives. That means pushing the indigenous people away from the cities and encroaching them to the hinterlands, right? The inter-Chaco. But then when out and raid the cities and raid the forts and raid everything, and those were really short and they were really effective and they would just like come back. Then later, around this time, Jesuit reductions, some of them, only like 3 or 4 in the entire Chaco geography, were established and were subtle, and they were kind of successful. And so those brought a period of alliances between indigenous people in the hinterlands and indigenous people in the reductions. So that was kind of like a quieter time. I would say from 1750 probably to the 1820 or 30, and which is post-colonial. But before that, before this, like between 1600 and 1750, it was all about the warfare. And it was very difficult for Spaniards to control because indigenous people of the Chaco have a fusión y fisión, so like a fusion fission sort of way of organizing their leadership and their attacks, and they changed leadership so much, and the Spaniards never knew who to talk to, and it was just it was very effective. That's what I mean. That's why when I talk about insurgent lands and insurgent people, is that the land of the Chaco really collaborated for the insurgency of their people because they knew it so well and because it was so difficult, right? And it was so mischievous. And the same river that you went through a month ago, maybe it was not the river that you could go through this other month. So it's kind of like a co-alliance. And up until the 1750, it was a really long period of war. After that, it settles a little with some Jesuit reductions, but it never truly stops. And it never truly stops until the late 19th century, right? That's like the true pacification of the Chaco, whatever that means, you know what that means. It really happens not in colonial times. It's never settled during the colonial times. Thank you. Yeah. What is this? Oh. What do I do here? How can I see them?
Yeah, that must be on high when we do.
Very inspiring.
Thank you. I think Juan Pablo wants to ask something, but I don't know how to see him. Can you?
Hi, Laura. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Hi.
Thank you so much for this. Congratulations. I have one question regarding your final remarks. You were talking about how you were inspired by when you visited communities and saw their work in like participatory cartography.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see if maybe you can share a little bit more details about your experience there. How some of these communities, if they've been able to see some of these maps, what are their thoughts? Because I imagine there's also some maps that can be kind of contradictory because they might show, we know all the problems that come up with these maps with the names given to indigenous people. So sometimes they may show that a certain region was controlled by a certain group of Guarani, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it was controlled by someone else, and that community still lives there. And they might be in conflict or in tensions with another indigenous community, and that other indigenous community might say like, hey, look at this map from the 18th century or 17th century. It shows that we had control of this area. and not this other indigenous community. So my question here is not only talking about Spanish and Jesuit dispossession of indigenous people, but amongst the different indigenous communities, how maybe there are some tensions that might arise from these colonial maps.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I think that's one of the most complicated thing about maps, that they were made, you know, we have to separate ourselves from the original intentions of how they were constructed and why, right? So they were constructed to assert the dominion of Hispano Creoles over land, but also they show these other things, like Juan Pablo was saying, sometimes maybe a map could say, I don't know, this is all, suppose that instead of saying enemigos, would say tobas, right? So many other groups of the Chaco could be, you know, negated in this image. So that's why I kind of like begin by saying we should not take the map at face value. Doesn't matter what it says, it's not about that, right? It's about how it functions. So that's one of the reasons that I moved away, and it has to do with my own experience working with the region and with people. I started doing field work with COM communities, so COM, also called Tobas, in the Chaco region. But then as I started, I was accompanying a process of collective mapping, right? And I soon realized that those families that self-identify as COM people had many relations with other people like Pilagas, you know, and Mocovíes or Huichíes and stuff like that, because we were all, you know, families that had been occupying the same space for so long, right? So that's one thing, that the inter-ethnic relations are always difficult, and particularly in places where indigenous communities were encroached. So, you know, we always need to have that care. And then for other part, I kind of moved away from ethnic names to a sort of modality of relation with the colonial empire. So I went away from talking about groups that belong to this or that partiality and talk about groups that traditionally, or like more likely than not, behave, you know, in an insurgent way in relation to colonial rule. So that to me was a way of making visible their presence without referring necessarily to the anonyms that sometimes we reproduce because they are so useful, and that's the only way that we can access that knowledge, right? But depending on how you use them, you can also be negating the existence of different people on that land. So my strategy for it was to refer to a mode of interaction, right? And I do speak of partialities when that's needed, and then when I revise some other documents, I go back to it. But I try to visit, you know, to make this possession visible for people that either collaborated or not collaborated, coerced or not, with the colonial rule. But in the case of people mapping nowadays, in my experience, it was funny because people were like, okay, so your families were here or came here 50 years ago to the same lagoon. And he was like, yeah, we come here. And then these other folks come here. And then these other people come here. And then these, you know, like, yeah, we use this space, and it is our space, which doesn't mean that it's our property, like our sole property, right? So one of the reasons that I moved away from ethnonyms as the principal way to go through maps is because people were, you know, talking about land property or use in a different way, not about like, this is our land, but this is our land, right? And we all use this space, sometimes in different times, sometimes for different reasons. So that's one of the challenges. But then you also have to go back and forwards because anonyms are the language of the state, right? And when indigenous people nowadays, they go to court or they write their narratives to be recognized as an indigenous communities, they have to use those words. If they don't use them, they don't get recognition. So it's kind of like pivoting from one and the other all the time because you want, you know, to make visible that those anonyms sometimes were not even indigenous. They're like identidades impuestas, or like they're imposed by, you know, language of the conqueror, but at the same time, they become a part of history. So I think like we're all of us are all the time making, you know, concessions and like moving away from those categories, but then recognizing that we can be idealistic and we need to be pragmatic to get some things done, right? So I think depending on the scenery, if I were to speak with a jury of law, I would stay very close to anonyms. That's what I'm trying to say. Does that answer your question, Juan Pablo, out there in the ether?
Yes, Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For sharing your experience.
Thanks.
First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I think I'd like to circle back to something that you said about your accents. Like expressing Tierra, Indios, Enemigos.
Yeah.
I think that I would have probably the same reaction. I was wondering if maybe you consider the possibility of discussing some environment. I don't know if it's true as indigenous visual criticism, which there is some in South America. I mean, the names that come to my mind at this moment are Maria Quijano,
Yeah.
like a sociology of image, but they work with Quechua and Mana cats. I don't know if there is some in Quechua that concerns the Chaco region. If it's something that I think larger question.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. That's something that really, really interests me, actually. So, when talking about maps as this kind of maps, I always say that, in an exercise of historical imagination, which is something that gets me a long way, but I always assume that all maps have indigenous participation, right? Because if we take the argument far enough, then yeah, you need to have, it's impossible that non-zero indigenous person had any sort of. They were the ones in New Zealand. They were the ones that guided the expeditions. They were the ones being taken prisoner. Like, I would never not assume indigenous participation. That's always like my departure point. Then, through some visual elements, I can either assert it or not. But that's like my ground zero. And then some other part of this work that comes to the 20th century has to do with photography and like ethnographical photography of the early 20th century. And that's kind of like where I use this apparatus that you refer to do a critique of some photographs that are not, that were taken by a German ethnologist, Robert Lehmann-Nietzsche, but they're not your typical, ethnography photography. They're not like the ones that we're used to see for the early 20th century. So I kind of like think about indigenous participation in the making of their own portraits and how they are subversive many times to the eye of the photographer. But it's a different medium, so you can say different things. You can talk about gestures, you can talk about postures, you can talk about the composition of the image. I think in cartography, I always take it as a starting point. And even, it happens in other documents, like the diaries of Jesuits that are traveling to the space. And they kind of like seem to magically be taken from one place to the other. They've never been there before. They just got off the ship and they're like navigating the Chaco like they were born there. And that's usually because they had, indigenous people that were taking them and keeping them alive. Like some of these people would have died 48 hours right after. And they didn't because they had, they would call them the boy, or they would call them, the people that's carrying our things, like they would talk about indigenous people as their messengers, but they were really their guides. And they're like this narrations of Jesus being bitten by snakes, and I was saved by the holy hand of God. And it's like, no, you were saved because this person knew exactly what to do at that point. So following that sort of train of thought, I always take indigenous participation as the starting point. And that sometimes is different in every kind of archive. It takes different forms. In this case, even in the second image, like it's so Europe aesthetic, but I still think that if Jerónimo Torras reached, like he finally got to La Cangaye after trying so many times, he didn't do it alone. So this map is heavily informed by actions of indigenous peoples. Does that kind of like come close? Yeah.
He works with Chaco, and I read something about he basically reassesses the ownership of maps, Chaco like other Mexico region, making some practical maps and bookings, secret data, that area. So yeah, I've never seen Chaco's maps.
No, thank you. Thank you. That was a great question. Thank you. Are we good? Are we ready? Thank you so much, everyone, for all your questions and your attention. Thank you.
and have lunch, eat stuff yourself.
I will.
Finish everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
How do